tonight's program. Some of the most powerful writing referenced here at the museum comes from veterans of war who saw the best and worst of humanity on the battlefields and returned to tell their stories. Tonight we welcome one of the most skilled writers working today telling those tales. Elliot Ackerman is the author of the novels Waiting for Eden, Dark at the Crossing, which was the finalist for the National Book Award, and Green on Blue. His writings have appeared in Esquire, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and the New York Times Magazine, among other publications, and his stories have been included in the Best American Short Stories and the Best American Travel Writing. He is both a former White House Fellow and a Marine, and served 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he received a Silver Star, the Bronze Star for Valor, and the Purple Heart. He divides his time between New York City and Washington, D.C. He's joined tonight by Peter Meyer, a writer and fellow Iraq veteran, whose post-war experience includes disaster response and work with the nonprofit With Honor, a group that encourages veterans to run for elected office, which he is now doing himself. So please welcome Elliot Ackerman and Peter Meyer. Thank you.
Well, welcome. So I'm Peter Meyer, and I'll be talking with Elliot here tonight. So tell me, this is a memoir.
I think you could call it a memoir in essays.
Mm-hmm. And you had this progression, talking from your experience in Afghanistan, translating that into Green on Blue, your work in Turkey, talking with Syrian refugees, translating a lot of that into Dark at the Crossing, and now this synthesis that's not fiction, but builds on a lot of those experiences. Just share a little bit on kind of how you chose, especially the story of Abu Qasr, which I think is really unites those themes when it comes to the translation of a conflict that basically continues to be recursive. It doesn't end. The guy who fought with Al-Qaeda in Iraq is now finding himself in a refugee camp in Turkey, looking at Syria.
First of all, it's great to be here. And Carrie, there you are. Thank you for having us. It's a really amazing museum. It's my first time coming here. So for all of you who are from Chicago, it's a real gift. So we were just sitting back there in the green room / typewriter room. I would encourage you to check that out if you haven't. It's very cool. And it got to me thinking, like, how do you assemble a book? And so just to go out for a second, this is the 4th book I've written. The other 3 are novels, and I consider myself a novelist, but this was the first one that I didn't know I was writing while I was writing it. So I also do a lot of work as a journalist, and I was actually probably 2 or 3 years into writing this book when I was wandering through a museum in London, the Portrait Gallery. I was with my girlfriend, who's much smarter than I am, and we were looking at a portrait of Edmund Burke. And if any of you know anything about Edmund Burke, he was a British writer who wrote in the end of the 18th century, and one of his most famous books is called Reflections on the Revolution in France. And if you read Reflections on the Revolution in France, it's nominally about France, but Burke was a conservative British intellectual, and it's really Burke railing kind of about what had just happened to the British and the American colonies 10 years before. So he's talking about France, but at every opportunity he will go on these long digressions into the abysmal execution of the war against the American colonists. And so she and I were talking about that, and she was basically saying that to me, and she said, you see, you're kind of doing in all these dispatches that you write, what you're doing is you're doing what Burke did. The idea of what makes that book a reflection is that when he looks at the revolution in France, what keeps staring back at him is the British experience in the American colonies. And I was writing these dispatches and I was covering the Syrian Civil War, but when I looked at the Syrian Civil War, what kept looking back at me was the American experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so one of the central kind of arcs that run through Places and Names is a friendship that I made with a guy named Abu Qasr. So I started traveling to southern Turkey in late 2013, and I went with an American friend of mine who had basically started a nonprofit, and I was I was living with him, and he kind of gave me my ticket to ride to be down there. And he was working at the time with a number of people who are a part of the growing Syrian diaspora in southern Turkey who'd fled. And one of them is a guy named Abed, who's featured very prominently in the book. And Abed and I had become friends, and one day Abed came in from a day's work in a Çakale refugee camp. And Çakale is this like wisp of a town right on the Turkish-Syrian border. It's bisected by a set of railroad tracks. On the north side of the tracks is Turkey, on the south side of the tracks is Syria. And so Abed came in, he pulled up to our little sort of house/office. Late at night, I was cooking dinner in the kitchen. And when he walked in the front door, he just asked me, "Hey, Abed, how was your day?" And he said, "Oh, Elliot, I had a very interesting day today." He's like, "I met a guy who I think you should meet." And I said, "Well, okay, Abed, who's the guy?" And he said, "Well, he fought for Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but I have a feeling the two of you would really get along." So, I'm sort of always up for anything, and Abed and I kind of made up a plan. We said, okay, his name was Abu Qasr, and he had run guns and fighters across the border from eastern Syria into Iraq, in Al-Anbar province where I had fought. And so the idea was basically that we would sit down, the two of us, two veterans of the Iraq War, except we had fought on opposite sides of the war. And that was a pretty wide-ranging conversation, and I thought I might read just very briefly to you from the book. But there was a moment in that conversation where, a lot of the conversation dealt with Abu Qasr, and he and I had a lot in common because we'd fought in many of the same places, and we talked about that. When were you the most afraid? What was the most difficult thing about fighting us? What was the most difficult thing about fighting against you? But Abu Qasr also had a very different worldview than I had, and he still very much adhered to this radical view of Islam, which at the time was being espoused by people like the Islamic State. And so he would kind of go into these polemicals, and my friend Abed, who is a very urbane guy from, Damascene guy, I could see that Abed would get very frustrated translating to me what Abu Qasr was describing. And what I sort of realized, and Abed and I talked about later, was that, Abed had gone out into the streets in 2011 and 2012 with this sort of irrefutable cause, which was nonviolent democratic protest, or nonviolent protests to demand democratic reforms from Bashar al-Assad. And he had seen his revolution completely destroyed and his home destroyed in the wake of that revolution. And sitting across from him was Abu Qasr, who was really kind of the force, or at least the ideas he represented was the force that had derailed Abed's revolution. And I had participated in a war in that part of the world that had also gone completely awry and left a huge wake of destruction in the region, but also personal destruction for the Americans I knew who fought on it, dead friends, Americans who came back wounded. And again, what Abed and I had in common was the person sitting across from us represented an ideology that had undermined both of these causes that had been the defining events of our life. So Abed and I had that connection, and there was a moment when Abed got up to leave, because he wound up translating for about 3 hours and just got tired. And I just want to read a little bit from that moment. So, as Abu Qasr rolls into this Islamist polemic, Abed interrupts his translating, scoffs, then turns to me and says with his perfect British accent, "Killing for peace is like killing for virginity." I laugh a little and smile at him. Abu Qasr asks Abed something in Arabic. He replies sharply, translating the same to Abu Qasr, whose face contorts around the idea. I'm worried he might take offense, but to my surprise, Abu Qasr begins to laugh too. "Who said that?" he asks Abed. "I don't know. Do you?" Abed asks me. "John Lennon," I say. "Who's that?" asks Abu Qasr. "He's an old dead rock singer," I say. "Older than you even." I point to Abu Qasr's thick black beard, which has gone salt and pepper. "War is enough to make you old," answers Abu Qasr. "Assad put the gray in my beard." Then he points to my sunken cheeks where a couple of gray whiskers have poked through. "George Bush put the gray in yours." My children also put the gray in my beard, I reply. Abu Asar nods. Yes, he says. It is a funny thing. What you love and what you hate both make you old. And I feel old, but I'm still just 33. I'm also 33, I say. Abed excuses himself and goes to the restroom out back. Abu Hasar and I sit next to each other on the same side of the table. Without our interpreter, the space between us becomes awkward. I open my notebook to a clean page. I begin to draw. First, I sketch out a long, oscillating ribbon running from the top left to the bottom right of the page, the Euphrates. Abu Hasar quickly recognizes this. He takes the pencil from my hand and draws the straight borderline between Iraq and Syria, one that cuts through a tabletop of hard pan desert. Along the border he's made, I write a single name, Al-Qaim. Next to that name, Abu Hasar writes 06.2005. I nod back and write 09.2004. I travel farther down the Euphrates and write another name and another date. Our hands now chase each other around the map, mimicking the way we'd once chased each other around this country. Haditha 07/2004/02/2005. Hit 10/2004/11/2006. On it goes. Only the dates and place names matter. These are a common language to us. One not even Abed can translate. Had I understood Arabic or had Abu Hasar understood English, I don't think we would have spoken. The small log we make on these two notebook pages contains the truth of our experience. Soon we've filled most of the map. Between us, one thing is missing. We have many places that overlap, nearly all of them, but we don't have a single date that does. Abu Hasar looks at me for a moment. I think he's noticed this too. Neither of us says or tries to say anything about it, but I think we are both grateful, or at least I am. Abed comes back from the restroom. I turn my notebook to a clean page.
So the idea of the places and the names being sort of that searching for overlap, the theme of continuity really stands out to me in contrasting these conflicts with previous ones. There's no, you think back to the maps of World War II where you'll have sort of the advancing Allied forces, the retreating Axis, the sort of pulse, but it goes in one direction. And we don't really have that in our conflicts. We have this sort of cyclicality where, there's a fighting here, there's fighting there, but the larger theme and the larger trend is kind of escaping. And I think in a lot of ways, searching for what that through line is and what that continuity is, that's what you're searching for in this book.
Yeah, I think, I'm listening. I think in the book, and one of the things that interests me is trying to chart the emotional topography of war and of conflict. And I think when you go to war, or actually, I don't think you even need to go to war. I think you just need to turn on your television these days. We are constantly being informed and encouraged to identify all of the many, many ways we are different, while paying very little attention to the myriad and more extensive ways that we are the same. And I think what the book tries to do, and what I kind of felt instinctually, what Abed felt instinctually when he said to me, I met this guy and I think the two of you would really get along, was that we had shared an experience, even though we fought on opposite sides of that. And the commonality of that experience on the back end meant that we had more in common with one another. And I felt, frankly, I had more in common with Abu Hasar than many of the people I went to high school with, because we had been similarly defined by this war.
Mm-hmm. And yet, so Abed is it fair to call him an idealist, at least in the beginning?
Well, I'm an idealist.
No.
I think like all of us, I think the thing that, that Abed, myself, and even Abu Hasar in the book, and many of the other people in the book who I mention who are caught up in these wars, is you've gone through you're an idealist, but you've also gone through this process of being defined by a little bit of your ideological dispossession. What I mean by that is being dispossessed of your ideals, that you believed one set of things when you were, maybe in your early 20s, and you went out into the street or into the military or wherever you went to try to realize those ideals. And maybe part of what you did was successful, but by and large, it didn't turn out the way you thought. and you are kind of defined in some ways by that failure. And you meet people along the way who've had very different experiences than you have. Abed and I have had a very different set of experiences. Abu Qasr and I had radically different sets of experiences, but again, the emotional topography, kind of the arc of what we went through emotionally, of being idealistic, seeing the reality of trying to implement these ideals or perform on this ideological spectrum, and seeing so much of the failure when we kind of wind up sitting together in, at that time, our early 30s, we've sort of traveled these parallel paths and can recognize the similarity in each other's experiences.
And, where the book, well, I don't want to, am I going to spoil anything with talking about sort of the final scenes with Abu Qasr? I mean, it very much, if Abed is still in the conflict from an NGO standpoint, from trying to help but not as a militant, not as a combatant, and you're now making sense of the conflict, kind of charting it from a journalistic standpoint, writing that first draft of history. And Abu Qasr, he's cleaned up. He doesn't have the jihadi kind of beard. He's clean shaven, but he's still kind of in it. The potential for him to keep fighting, to stay in, still exists. I mean, how is it that the conflict kind of spins out sort of the idealist, the cynic, but then also a little bit of that messianic trajectory?
Well, I think in fairness to Abu Qasr, I think if he were sitting up there, he would laugh and say, Peter, Elliot's still in it. I talked to him. He still thinks that all these Western ideas are good ideas. I mean, he doesn't see the error of his ways yet. So I try to do my best, and through our friendship, all of us to to steer clear of being invisible to the context of how I view the world. Certainly towards the end of the book, I mean, there isn't a real clean resolution in the book. There's just this sort of continual commitment of, at least among the three of us, to just be in touch because we have been similarly defined by these conflicts, even though there are many, many things politically that none of us agree on.
Now, kind of stepping back from the particulars a little bit, you've written now hundreds of thousands of words on these conflicts. If you could distill that into one theme or message that you could communicate to someone who's not familiar with the wars or has maybe only seen them on the news, what would that be? What is the essence that we're dealing with?
It's a really easy question, Peter. Geez, I don't know. I think one of the things I never feel when I'm writing about war that I'm actually writing about war. I feel like when you tell people you're writing about war, they're like, oh, you're writing about tanks and bombs and planes flying around, and that's never what I'm sitting around there thinking about. I think most writers are trying to just, this might sound trite, so I apologize, but you're just trying to write about what it is to be a human being and the range of human emotions that exist. And I think one of the things that's interesting is one of the things the wartime experience provides is it gives you the chance to witness a very wide angle of what we are capable of humans. On the one end, the real savagery and depravity that we are capable of as a species. And at the far end, too, in war, you see incredible acts of sacrifice, love, and empathy. And so for me, I guess, maybe when I'm trying to make sense of the human experience as a writer, I'm also trying to make sense of war because I have come to understand what it means to be a human, often through the prism of being involved in conflict and war. I don't know if that answered the question, but
no, it does. It does. I mean, but it also gets to how war has a certain gravity. I mean, both of us have found it challenging to escape that gravitational pull. You talk about, I don't know if friend is the right word, but someone who reached out to you in Istanbul, who was also a military veteran, and just felt like he had to get closer, get back to this thing that he had kind of circled around and maybe had seen glimpses of, but didn't fully understand. And so the first thing he does when he gets out of the military is flies to Istanbul, wanting to be close. And 2012, right after I graduated from college, I was on a frustrating trip, and I was like, okay, you know what? Look up at the board. Oh, there's a flight to Tunis. They just had a revolution. Let's go see it there. Like, what is it that keeps pulling us back to the conflicts?
Well, the person, Peter Simon, there's one of the people I write about in the book is a guy named Vince, and I first met Vince. He literally just reached out to me on Twitter because he saw I was in Istanbul and had been a Marine, and he'd been a Marine. And when I met him, he was teaching English in a Turkish school, and it sort of just migrated to that part of the world, and we were getting a drink one night, and he was telling me these kind of wild stories. He was actually telling me when he was living in this city, in Chicago, in 2011, really kind of at the height of the Arab Spring, and he'd traveled to the region extensively, had a number of friends there, particularly in Egypt. And he said he was studying creative writing at the time, and he was in his creative writing seminar, I believe it was on a Tuesday, and he saw some of his friends on Twitter organizing for protests on a Friday in Tahrir Square. And he said, you know what, I'm going. And he got on a flight that night, flew from Chicago to Cairo. I think he landed in Cairo on a Wednesday or a Thursday, went to the protest on a Friday, and then he wound up almost getting arrested and then got evacuated out of Cairo on a Sunday by the State Department and wound up back in his creative writing seminar the next Tuesday. And he sort of told me the story. I was kind of slack-jawed. I was like, wow, that's like a hell of a week, Vince. And he's like, yeah. He's like, you know what? It made me like the coolest guy in my creative writing seminar. But in all seriousness, I sort of asked him at one point when I saw him in Istanbul when we met. I was like, hey man, like, what are you really doing here? And he looked at me and just said, I just want to be close to it. It made me think, and I write about this in the book. I was like, what is the it? Yeah. Like, what is this it that Vince wants to be close to? And I think it's an experience that's so large, that you find your meaning in it, but also when you're standing next to something that's so large, you can lose yourself in these types of experiences. And I've certainly met people who've kind of been consumed by trying to be present at these events that are world-defining events. And so I think there's a real thrall that comes with that.
Mm-hmm. Shifting to kind of I'd say the U.S. military combatant experience, when talking about some of the men you lost in Iraq, you say, when I think about my wars and what happened, I do sometimes ask myself if it was worth it. But I'm not thinking about Bush or Obama or about Iraq or Afghanistan. I'm thinking about Pratt and Ames and, of course, Dan, and unfortunately other friends like him. I wonder what they'd say. I hope they'd think what we did for each other was worth it. And later you touch upon this duality of fighting, where on the one hand you have a mission, you have a reason why you're doing it, and that mission is the precedence. But on the other hand, there's this deeper alignment that you're fighting for the folks on either side of you. But that mission is what's imperiling the people on either side. Can you speak of that tension a little bit?
Sure. I think, war is certainly one of those experiences that exists that has that real dual nature to it, the good and the bad. And I think that, but that's something that's not just common to war. And I think what I often am trying to do in my writing is show like emotional equivalencies, things that some people might say, oh, this must be exclusive to war. And I say, no, this is something that happens in life all of the time. And it's funny, when I was actually writing that, I was thinking of the movie City Slickers. Has anybody ever seen City Slickers? So there's a great moment where like the three guys, they're like riding on their horses, and Bruno Kirby is one of the guys, that actor, and they're talking about what was your best day and your worst day. And Billy Crystal tells his story, the other guy tells his story, and Bruno Kirby tells this story about a day when his dad, who was a brute, came home, and his dad was being rough with his mom, and then he stood up, and he punched his dad in the face, took his mom, they moved out, and he said, that was the last time I ever saw my dad, that bastard. And Billy Crystal's like, he's like, so that was your worst day? He's like, whoa, that sounds like a pretty bad day. He's like, no. He's like, that was my best day and my worst day. And that idea that, I think for many of us, your best and your worst days can be the same day. So if you were to ask me, like, hey, Elliot, think about the 10 best days of your life, and I would probably, if I was doing it on my hands, I would hold up like this many fingers, and I'd say, okay, and they get like, okay, now think of, the 10 worst days of your life. And I'd hold the same amount of fingers, and those would be days I was in combat. Like, they're the exact same days. Things that people did, that we did for each other, that I'm very proud of. And also knowing on that exact same day, like, really tragic things happened, and people were hurt or people were killed. And so what do you do with those, experiences? There's no easy resolution to all of that. And so I think that's the duality of that experience, but I think there are many experiences as well that adhere to that.
Well, and in the phrase that I loved, that I think is very apt, freebasing the crystal meth of purpose. You're so infused by the totality of an experience that, like, how do you replicate that? How do you, can you keep chasing that high?
Sure. In that section, people have asked me a lot, will ask me a lot, and actually among friends of mine who are veterans, we'll talk about the issue like PTSD. I have a great friend of mine who was sort of like my big brother in the Marine Corps, and he's still, he works in special operations and is still deploying overseas. And the way we keep up is we go running together very early in the mornings, his choice, not mine. But, and on one of our runs, I remember he was like, we're like, so do you think you have PTSD? And we were kind of casually talking, like, I don't know, do you think you have it? And like, sometimes I have these bad dreams, sometimes I feel sad, but is that really PTSD? We were kind of analyzing that. And I think that idea of PTSD we've given it like a huge definition in our society. So I think there is this thing that is PTSD, because I don't want to diminish it, which is, people who are, have nightmares, have flashbacks, and like that is a very real thing. But there's this much larger issue, and I think in some ways this more insidious issue, which is around purpose. So I think we can all probably agree that to be happy in life, like, you have to have a purpose, like why you're getting up each day. To give a very banal example of that, I'd say, listen, let's say there's a man, he works a job, the job puts food on the table for the family, watches his children grow, they get a better education than him, from that he derives his purpose. Well, when you go to war at, 19, 20, 21 years old, at a very young age, you develop, I would say, a pretty dysfunctional relationship with purpose. So let's say, you're in Afghanistan and your mission is to secure a hilltop outpost, or you're in Baghdad and you have a neighborhood that you have to patrol, and you have this mission that, at least on the tactical level, is pretty clear. And you are doing it with probably a group of people who will become some of your very best friends. And so if purpose is that drug that induces happiness, you at 20, 21, however young you are, you start out and you are freebasing, again, that crystal meth of purpose. There is nothing more intense than what you're doing. Let's say you do it for a year, 2 years, 4 years, 6 years. Eventually you come home and the war is over, and you have to figure out what you're going to do next. You have to repurpose yourself. What's going to come next? And you look out at what's available to you, and maybe you're going to go back to college. Maybe you're going to sell real estate. Maybe you're going to go work at Home Depot. And you look at what you just did, which was this crystal meth, and what you are confronted with isn't crystal meth. It's like Coors Light. And so you realize, okay, I'm home. I'm going to spend the rest of my life basically sitting on my front porch drinking Coors Light. And a certain depression sets in. And I've seen a lot of people and know a lot of people who've struggled with repurposing themselves.
Do you think it's worth it? To take the crystal meth?
I think it's complicated, and I think that, again, it's not just the war that does it. So is that PTSD? I don't know. I would say that's kind of a similar emotional arc, or a similar emotional trajectory that you might see with, like, and you do see this, professional athletes who peak at a very young age, or people who are very successful early, anyone who has sort of reached the summit of something has to kind of reckon with the descent. But it often, with veterans, is manifested as this is PTSD. And it's interesting because that idea has evolved over many years. Like, we call it PTSD, and that's really a creation of the Vietnam era, that clinical diagnosis. They used to call it, particularly around the First World War, we all know shell shock was what they called it. In the Civil War, they had a very poetic word for it. It was soldier's heart, was what they called it after the Civil War. But the first time it actually comes out historically was in the Napoleonic Wars, and it's actually my favorite definition. And after the Napoleonic Wars, the soldiers who fought Napoleon, they just called it nostalgia.
So you have 2 children, right? They're going to be teenagers in a few years. what would you say to them if they wanted to follow in your footsteps and join the military?
Yeah, well, between my girlfriend and I, we have 4. I would just tell them, I would just want them to understand what it was, and I would want them to be able to have the freedom to make their own decision, being as well informed as they could possibly be. I know that's how I would want to be treated. I think that's how you should handle it with a child. But I think one of the things that's remarkable is these wars have gone on so long is now I have friends of mine who are older than me, like the staff non-commissioned officers I worked with, and their kids are now going into the military. It's funny, if you open Stars and Stripes, there's sort of a perennial story that will often appear in the Stars and Stripes, and it's like this kind of good news story of father and son serving together in Afghanistan, and it's a 55-year-old guy and his son's 23, and they're together. And it's actually a really depressing story. It's like, oh my God, really? Now we have intergenerational service. Why can't we wrap up these wars? But I'd want them to be able to make their own decision.
Yeah, and that's a bigger question than I think we can handle in one night. But I guess we'll shift to some audience questions in a minute. But you also talk about sort of the overarching narrative in some of these conflicts and how you have a story of how a battle played out can be more important than how the battle actually plays out. How others interpret it, what it does to morale. And inherently when you're writing a book, you need to find a narrative. And I always think of a narrative like a cookie cutter. You stamp it down, you have the outline. What are the pieces of dough that kind of fell out? What are the stories that you wanted to tell but didn't necessarily, they fell outside of that diagram?
Oh, I don't know which ones fell out necessarily outside of that diagram, and it's tough because this was sort of an accidental book. As I mentioned, I didn't know I was reading it, but I would say, I think narratives have a shape too. Some kind of the narrative arc is what they call it. I would say if this book had a shape, it would be a circle. Don't let that dissuade you. But the journey is sort of this circular journey, right? So if you're traveling around a circle, it sounds obvious to say this, but no point on the circumference of a circle is the same point. However, one thing all points on a circumference of a circle have in common is they all have a similar center point. And so the center point of this journey you take in the book, which is sort of circular, for me were these experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I'm sort of walking around them as I journey around the Middle East, I'm trying to just understand them from every perspective. So I'm taking this kind of journey in, our contemporary, I don't want to call them conflicts, but in Turkey and Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, but that journey is kind of allowing me to walk around events that happened a decade before at the same time.
Will that circle ever spin out into something that may have finality?
I don't know. People. There's a part in this book. I go back to Fallujah where I fought. I go back 12 years later, and stand in some of the places that were meaningful to me. And people have said oh, was that cathartic? And it wasn't cathartic because the conflict wasn't over. I was showing up. I fought in the second battle of Fallujah. I was showing up in the wake of the third battle, but. That being said, so that was not cathartic, but I would love to imagine a day where I could return to Afghanistan and see old friends and go skiing. I think that would be pretty cathartic. But sadly, we're not there yet.
Well, and you also mentioned, I think it was Zombi, who was also a Marine special operator who was killed in Qasr City, had the helicopter landing zone named after him. He was killed by Iranian-backed Shia militia forces. Those same forces later in fighting ISIS took off from that same helicopter, adjacent to that helicopter landing zone, to attack the Islamic State.
Yes. So if you were able to follow all of that, it's complex. But I have a very good friend who was killed fighting in Qasr City by Iranian-backed militias, and he was a very large figure in the Marine Corps. And when he died, one of the landing zones in Baghdad International Airport was named after him. And then almost a decade later, as the Islamic State was moving across Iraq, and the Shia government in Iraq invited the Iranians to help combat the Islamic State with some of their militias, the Iranians were flying their drones off of that airfield to help call in American bombers on the Islamic State. So sort of this, real kind of bitter irony or futility that, what is it, again, what is it all for?
No. Well, on that note, I strongly encourage. This is a fantastic book. I'm a big fan of marginalia while I'm reading, and it was effusive with praise. But Elliot, well done. This is a fantastic synthesis. I think with that, I would love to take some questions from the audience. And I can pass around the microphone. Okay. Any other stories before we get to the questions?
Someone always has to go first.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, we have some hands up, but I think. Okay.
I'll repeat it.
Before we were in Afghanistan, the Russians were in Afghanistan, I don't know, for a couple of decades. We've been in Afghanistan for more than a decade. I think now there's a peace initiative. I guess you think the peace initiative makes sense and that makes sense for us to be there or to get out?
The question was about kind of the current peace initiative in Afghanistan that involves reconciliation with the Taliban in one form or another. And I think there are a number of things you can look at with our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan that we can say were real strategic mistakes. I believe, particularly to Afghanistan, one of the great strategic blunders we made in Afghanistan was the real immediate bonding between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and the conflation between the two in our minds, and not understanding the differences that existed there. And I think that probably has prolonged the war for more than a decade, and understanding that the Taliban, who are largely their interests being are Afghan nationalists with few transnational terrorist objectives, are very different from Al-Qaeda, but we immediately conflated the two, and I think undoing that took 10 years, at least in American minds, and I think it's relevant because it's American politicians who are making the calculations, okay, is it viable to wind down this war, or do I just keep it going, and is that politically easier? And if the Taliban are the exact same as Al-Qaeda, it makes it very difficult to be negotiating with the Taliban. I'm hopeful that there could be some type of reconciliation and peace in Afghanistan. I think it's obviously very, very complex. But the war for us has gone on for 18 years, and for Afghans, far, far longer. So.
How did you decide to join the service?
It's really sort of, I think, a confluence of things. I grew up overseas, so I grew up in London, and I think just being an American abroad, you kind of, you're an outsider looking in a little bit, and that made me feel a little bit like I wanted to give something back. I think I knew I did ROTC, and so I was an officer, and so I had this sense of, when I got out of college, I wanted a lot of responsibility. I wanted a job where whether I was good at my job or bad at my job really mattered. And so, the Marine Corps gave you that responsibility very young. And I was also the kid who never stopped playing with his G.I. Joes. So you kind of, an interest in the military, a desire to, all of that kind of, those three things coming together, sent me into the Marine Corps. But I made the commitment to go into the Marine Corps in 1998 and then was commissioned in 2003. So the world changed a lot in those years.
So you're highly decorated. You commanded at Fallujah. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so you've had a perspective that few have had, and you did 5 tours of duty. And so as you see what's going on currently, are you weighing in any shape or form? You're a journalist right now. So how do you handle that? And I know that soldiers don't do politics, but I'm just wondering if you have feelings that you're able to express either through your writing or in conferences like this, or...
Yeah, I mean, I'm a writer, and so I think that good writing is never pedantic. Like, I think that good writing shows, it doesn't tell, and you know, the only service I try to provide is to try to tell stories and show things to people. And when I read, because I'm also a reader, the reading I like to do, I like to read books and read, you know, whether fiction or nonfiction or essays, where the writer gives me enough courtesy and enough space to come to my own conclusion as to the information that I am being provided. So, you know, I like being a writer. I don't want to be a pundit, you know. And I also, and frankly, I kind of subscribe to, you know, what I call, you know, the wisdom of Socrates, which is, I know that I am wise because I know that I know nothing. Like, there are no easy issues. I mean, anyone who comes up and can tell you in a 3 to 5 minute soundbite how they're going to solve all of these problems in our country, problems in Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan or you name it, like, you know, they're selling you snake oil. Like, these are very, very complex issues. You know, the one thing I will say, you know, particularly covering the wars in Syria and as an American, is that, you know, the U.S., you know, has an important role to play right now in the Middle East, but we are not, I believe, we are not the central actors. We are an ancillary actor. They're just like the Russians are, just like others are. You know, the people who live there, whose countries those are, you know, they are the ones who have to determine their futures and the direction they want their societies to go in. It's not incumbent on us. I think often as Americans, we have this sort of belief, we walk around looking at these issues saying, you know, if there's just some like policy alchemy, if we can just get the formula right, we're gonna solve this problem for everybody. And God knows that's gotten us in a lot of trouble over the past.
So Mr. Meyer hasn't tried to recruit you to run for office?
No.
Question about the tactical and the strategic. So you said your mission, you described your mission in one case was there's a hilltop you had to protect or a street you had to patrol or something. But I wonder, did you and your men at some point ask yourselves and talk about the wider purpose? Are we really achieving a mission here beyond tactical? And I'm thinking of when you went into Iraq and the purported reason to go into Iraq was undermined by reports that there's no weapons of mass destruction here, et cetera. And maybe that tension between the strategic, why are we here, larger purpose, national purpose, or even helping the people there might have been another sort of larger purpose. Did that come frequently to your mind? Did it go through a transition? Did you ever get out of the tactical and helping your buddies and all this and see a wider context, and did that turn you into a cynic, or did you find that your role was really positive and really meritorious?
Well, I think there's, in the moment, meaning when you're sitting there on a deployment, and again, it depends when we're talking about, you know, when I was in Iraq, I was 24 years old, and most of the guys in my platoon were anywhere between 19 and 22. So that's who you're talking about, all of us together. And we had all joined the Marines. Many of the guys at that time had joined the Marines either a little bit before 9/11 or right after 9/11. And they wanted to be Marines. And they were in the Marine Corps, and they were doing exactly what you, at that time, exactly what you sign up to do in the Marine Corps. And our days were pretty busy and pretty intense. So we, for the most part, weren't kind of sitting around wondering, you know, what does this all mean? I think after the fact, you know, we've talked about, yeah, was it worth it? You know, the policy of it. Was it a futile policy? And everybody has opinions, and we, you know, can, you know, analyze the policy. But I think what the experience means for most of us is like it's a much more personal thing. It's like, you know, when we get together and we talk, usually we're like telling stories about things that had happened. You know, remember that time with Dan? Yeah, that was a tough day, or this or the other thing, as opposed to kind of talking about the larger geopolitical forces at play. I don't say that to be callous or make it sound like we're not sitting there thinking or caring about those things, but they're such personal experience is what everyone did for each other, that when we're all together, we're not kind of, waxing, my experience has been waxing philosophic about, can you believe there were no WMDs, and well, they should have known, we're usually just kind of talking about, specific days and specific places where we were and events.
At the outset of the evening, I thought I heard you say that this was a memoir in essays, and I wonder if you could speak to that form. Did you find it to be constraining, invigorating? What was it like to write this book in that way?
Sure. Well, I had written there are many of these pieces where I had them, and that when my girlfriend said, hey, you're writing a book, and I was like, oh my God, maybe I am. And then I went and looked at this body of journalism I had done, and I had to look and say, yes, I see how all of these are connected, how there's this sort of shape of a book in here. And then I had to go into some of those pieces where maybe I'd been constrained because I had a word length of that article, and I had my notes that, okay, I'm gonna really blow this piece out. There are other things where I needed to put in whole segments of the book as connective tissue. So for me, it was more like seeing the scaffolding of a book, and then knowing that I had to really kind of put up a whole building, and then take that scaffolding down. But the core of the book, that scaffolding or the spine or whatever your metaphor is, are these essays, and that's why I say it's a memoir in essays.
Since you finished the book, has there been any more information on Austin Tice?
Nothing that I know of specifically since I finished the book. I think the consensus, I'm sorry, for people who don't know, Austin Tice is a former Marine turned journalist who, between his second and third year of law school at Georgetown, went to Syria to work as a freelancer and disappeared around Damascus. I think the consensus is that he's being held by the Assad regime. So I think that's sort of the prevailing wisdom, although I don't know anything more specific than that.
Any other questions? Can I ask one final question of both of you? And Elliot, you were quoted in talking at one point about this book, about the notion of having to make the decision to leave the war, since we have an all-volunteer army, and that one of the issues here, and since both of you have served, what does it mean to have to make that decision, and how did it affect you, and how do you see it affecting others?
Yeah, well, I think it goes to your question a little bit of, what are you talking about? The wars become very personal, and because they've gone on so long, there hasn't been like a signing ceremony on a battleship, or even helicopters coming off the embassy. So every time you come back, there's sort of this question, among people who you serve with, who inevitably kind of become your very best friends, and it's like, so you're going to go on the next deployment? What are you going to do next? And it's very difficult to look at those people and say, no, I'm done. You can go on the next one. I'm going to go do something else. But every single person you meet who's served in these wars at some point has kind of had to do that to a varying degree, and had to basically what I would say declare a separate peace and say, you know what, I know it's still going on, but it's over for me. And that's it's a complicated decision.
I mean, you see the updates from your friends, you hear those stories, all of a sudden a story that you had a part in writing is now being sort of written without you. And that, you kind of feel like trying to reminisce. It's like the high schooler kind of going back around the lockers and being like, so is, Principal so-and-so still teaching here? I mean, like that, it just kind of continued on without you.
And to put a point on it, and I think, frankly, it's happened. This has happened to me less now. But you say it's done for you, and then you have friends who are getting killed. Mm-hmm. And like that's tough. When you've been out for 2 or 3 years, and you have a friend who's still going in, and yeah, that's right, you're leaving. Let's get a cup of coffee before you head out. They head out, and and then they don't come back. That is very tough, and I think that is probably has places. Many vets I know that has puts a real strain on when you've declared your separate peace and you have friends who are not only going, but in some cases getting killed.
Well, I want to thank you both. Thank everybody for coming out, and if we could all give a big thanks to these two gentlemen.
Thank you.